Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The day Praise married Michael. The sky over Abaddon hung low like a wet blanket, gray with the kind of silence that usually came after a heavy argument. The church where the ceremony held was modest, squeezed between an abandoned carpenter's workshop and a rundown bookshop whose signboard read, "Wisdom is Principle," the L barely hanging on. Only 2 pews were filled, mostly by the church's choir members and one curious neighbor who came for the rice, not the vows. Her mother stood outside, arms folded, refusing to step in. It wasn't the kind of wedding that made women cry from joy or men slap backs in approval. Instead, there was a discomfort in the air, like everyone was waiting for the bride to snap out of a trance. Praise wore a plain white dress that fit too tightly around her ribs and carried a bouquet that looked more like a broom than a blossom. Michael, wearing a second-hand navy blue suit that had clearly outlived its fashion era, waited for her with a stillness that bordered on shame. They held hands, but their fingers didn't interlock tightly. When the pastor asked if anyone objected, a baby started crying loudly in the back, and for a brief moment, everyone looked toward the door. But nothing happened. No dramatic scene, no running groom, no objections, just quiet disapproval. After the ceremony, they stepped out to the sound of their own footsteps. Not a single clap followed them. No music played, only the distant hum of a generator battling a tired afternoon. Praise smiled, not because she felt victorious, but because she was too tired to cry. She had chosen a man with empty pockets and a hopeful heart, and somewhere in her mind, that had to count for something. Michael squeezed her hand gently as they walked toward the rusting Okada that would take them to their new home, his breath smelling faintly of worry. Praise didn't flinch. She leaned into him, not for love in that moment, but for balance. They lived in a single-room apartment tucked behind a mosque in Okadu, where the roof whined with every rainfall, and the door struggled to shut without the help of a strong wind or a good kick. Their landlord, a stout man with a gut that entered the room before he did, had warned them not to bring babies into the compound unless they wanted to be fined. "This house no be for crying and pampers," he had said with a grin that revealed more gaps than teeth. Michael's belongings fit into one traveling bag, a few shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, and a faded notepad filled with business ideas scribbled in desperate handwriting. The room had a thin mattress on the floor, and a small stool Praise used to place their plastic kettle and a candle. They cooked outside with a charcoal stove they borrowed from a neighbor who sold fried akra in the mornings. Every evening, the scent of burning oil mixed with Praise's soft humming as she peeled yam or watched beans soften in the pot. Michael left early most days, taking his resume to offices, cyber cafes, and construction sites, only to return with dust on his shoes and a look that always hovered between apology and fatigue. Praise never asked him if he got rejected again. She already knew. She saw it in the way he struggled to smile when she opened the door, how he dropped his bag gently like it carried shame. At night, they sat in the dark because the light only came when Nipa remembered their street. Sometimes they talked about the future in whispers, as though speaking it out loud would scare it away. Other times they said nothing at all, their silence louder than their dreams. Yet, every single morning before Michael left, Praise said the same words as she kissed his forehead. "One day, God will put a smile on our faces." And every single time, he nodded like someone who wanted to believe more than he actually did. Back in the market where Praise hustled, her presence was met with a strange blend of pity and disdain. She sold pepper, onions, and occasionally garden eggs on a faded wooden tray beside a cement wall smeared with old posters for lost dogs and upcoming crusades. Women who once called her sister now greeted her with tight-lipped nods or worse, pretended not to see her at all. The young man who ran the phone accessories kiosk beside her often joked loudly with customers about women who throw themselves away in the name of love. "You fine like this, and you marry man way no get anything?" "Nah spiritual attack," he once said, laughing until he coughed. Praise didn't respond. She simply adjusted her tray and turned her face away, watching a dog chase its tail across the street. But the comments stuck to her skin like harmattan dust, unwelcome, persistent, and hard to wipe off. Some days, she sold enough to buy Gary and smoked fish. Other days, she came home with only coins and stories. But even then, she shared half of her portion with Michael, who ate in silence, each bite soaked in silent gratitude. They didn't talk about money unless absolutely necessary. Their love was becoming a quiet thing, something not shouted but endured. And in that endurance, there was a kind of romance only the broke understand. Praise told herself often that things would get better, not because she saw signs, but because believing otherwise would break her. Her prayers were no longer long. They were just whispers now, tossed toward heaven like fragile paper planes. "Help us," she would mutter. "Please." She stopped asking for riches. Now all she wanted was a day without insult, a meal without counting coins, and a life where her name didn't make people smirk. Michael, on his part, carried his own cross with quiet desperation. He never told Praise how many times he had been turned away, how many men had laughed in his face after promising a call back. He cleaned cars in a hotel car park some mornings, helped load building materials in the afternoons, and on particularly rough days, rode along with Kiki drivers just to learn the routes, hoping one day someone would trust him with a tricycle of his own. His pride took frequent beatings, but he buried each one like a secret in his chest. Once, he saw an old classmate step out of a bank wearing a crisp white shirt and polished shoes. The man barely recognized him. When he did, he gave Michael a handshake that felt more like charity than brotherhood, stuffing a crumpled 500 Nigerian nairas note into his hand like a beggar's tip. Michael took it, smiled, and thanked him. Later that night, he didn't mention it to Praise. Instead, he returned home with 2 meat pies and a bottle of malt, saying he got a small contract. Praise lit up like someone who had just seen Christmas arrive in April. She placed the food on their shared plate and insisted they eat together. That night, they ate slowly, not because they wanted to savor the taste, but because they knew joy was in short supply and must be consumed carefully. As the fan rotated lazily overhead and the candle flickered beside them, Michael watched Praise laugh over something small he said and felt a lump form in his throat. She hadn't left. She hadn't mocked him. She still looked at him like he mattered. And in a city that measured men by the size of their wallet, that was the only thing keeping his spirit alive. He reached for her hand under the table and held it. No words, no promises. Just the grip of 2 people trying not to drown in the deep waters of their own beginning. Every day started the same for Praise. She would wake up just before the call to prayer echoed from the nearby mosque, the sound floating into their room like smoke through a cracked window. The darkness of the room greeted her like an old friend, her eyes already used to the outlines of their small world. The old metal hanger where 2 shirts dangled like tired flags, the chipped enamel cup beside their kerosene stove, and the small mirror that had long since lost its ability to flatter. She would sit for a moment, hands folded in her lap, silently gathering the courage to face another day. The water in their blue plastic bucket was always cold, and when it touched her skin, she clenched her teeth, not from the chill alone but from the awareness of how little she had control over. After bathing, she would wrap herself in a plain wrapper, tie a scarf over her hair, and quietly begin to prepare Michael's breakfast. Most mornings it was just pap and a few pieces of akara bought the night before. She would warm them slowly, listening to the hiss of oil in the pan and the hum of early traffic. It was during these silent rituals that she reminded herself who she was. Not a failure, not a fool, but a woman waiting for her season. Sometimes she whispered it aloud, like a prayer to herself. It's not foolishness to wait for rain, even in the dry season. Michael would wake up just before she finished setting the food on the stool. He rarely spoke immediately. He would sit up slowly, rub his eyes with both hands like a man searching for a new day inside his palms, then nod toward her with tired gratitude. Neither of them had the energy for small talk. They ate in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need explanation. When he stood to leave, she handed him a black nylon bag containing his resume, a bottle of water, and sometimes an orange. It was all she could afford, but he received it like a gift, kissed her forehead softly, and left through the creaking door. She always stood by the window and watched him walk away until he disappeared into the crowd of motorbikes, hawkers, and dust. Praise spent her own days behind a wooden bench in front of a small kiosk owned by Mama Jide, a woman who sold recharge cards and painkillers, but behaved like she ran a corporation. Praise sold onions and tomatoes from a rusty tray she balanced on 2 crates. There was no shade to protect her from the sun, and no fanfare when she arrived. People barely noticed her anymore. She had become a part of the background, like the potholes on the road or the smell of diesel in the air. Occasionally, a few customers would buy from her, sometimes out of pity, sometimes out of habit. But most walked past without a glance, heading instead to the bigger stalls run by women who wore gold bangles and spoke English with a confidence Praise couldn't afford. On one particularly hot afternoon, a group of younger girls, their faces powdered and their dresses tight enough to command attention, passed by her corner. One of them slowed down and said loudly to her friends, "Na this kind suffer love day make person old before her time." They laughed, high-pitched and cruel, their footsteps bouncing as they moved on. Praise didn't respond. Her fingers tightened around a soft onion she had been sorting, crushing it slightly. The juice leaked onto her wrapper, but she didn't bother to wipe it. She just stared into the space where the girls had walked, her eyes glassy but dry. Around her, the market moved with noisy indifference, hawkers shouting prices, generators coughing to life, and the blare of a distant horn fighting the sun. Praise turned back to her tray and resumed her sorting. Her movements were slow, mechanical, as if each tomato weighed more than it should. The hours dragged, each one feeling like a sentence in a story that refused to end. But even on days like that, she stayed until dusk, watching the light fade from the sky and the shadows grow longer. Her shoes often tore at the soles, and her wrapper would gather the dirt of the roadside, but she never left early. She waited, as if expecting a miracle to walk past her tray one day and ask for change. Michael's routine had begun to chip away at him like water on stone. At first, he had walked with confidence, entering offices with a firm handshake and a bright smile, telling people about his degree in economics and his dreams of building a logistics company. But as weeks turned into months and months blurred into years, the brightness faded. He began to walk slower, avoid eye contact, and speak only when spoken to. His resume was now wrinkled from overuse, the ink smudged in places from rain and sweat. He had memorized his lines, so well they no longer sounded real. Sometimes, when he entered a reception and saw the way the receptionist looked at his shoes, he would turn around and leave before even asking for an interview. Pride is a delicate thing. It breaks loudly the first time, then crumbles silently after that. On some days, Michael helped a carpenter carry planks across construction sites in Dugby, earning enough to buy bread and sardine. On better days, he shadowed a dispatch rider he had befriended, hoping to get trained if a motorbike ever became available. The hardest moments came not from hunger or tiredness, but from recognition. One afternoon, while carrying a bag of cement across a narrow alley in Ring Road, he heard someone call his name. It was a former classmate from university, now working at an insurance firm. The man's eyes widened with polite shock, his smile unsure. "Mike? You? Here?" Michael smiled back, adjusted the bag on his shoulder, and nodded. "Just passing through." That night, he didn't sleep. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing the man's voice over and over. He thought about what Praise would say if she knew. But when she asked how his day went, he simply replied, "Progress, small, small." Praise believed him. Or at least she pretended to. That unspoken loyalty, her refusal to let him drown alone, was the rope he clung to every time the world pushed him under. Their love was no longer the kind found in fairy tales or Nollywood scripts. It had mutated into something harder, deeper, and far less romantic. There were no surprise dates or candlelit dinners. What they had now was the kind of love that survived on endurance and fragments of hope. It was a love that waited in queues for cheap Gary, that measured rice by milk tins, and drank water before bed to silence a growling stomach. Yet, it was in these small miseries that they found an odd kind of intimacy. They knew each other's weaknesses without judgment, understood each other's silences without asking for explanation. Praise had memorized the way Michael sighed when he was discouraged, the exact way his left eyebrow twitched when he wanted to cry, but wouldn't allow himself. Michael, in turn, had studied her, how she held her stomach when she was hungry but pretended not to be, how she always placed the bigger portion of food on his side of the plate even when she thought he wasn't looking. They never said, "I love you" anymore. Not because they didn't mean it, but because those words felt too small, too cheap for the kind of war they were fighting. Instead, they showed it, in meals shared in silence, in clothes mended quietly, in hands held beneath frayed bed sheets while the city outside slept and forgot them. Ibadan had moved on, buzzing with ambition and noise, while they stayed trapped in a pocket of struggle that felt invisible. And still each night, before closing her eyes, Praise would whisper into the darkness, "Maybe tomorrow." It wasn't a prayer anymore. It was a lifeline, a single thread she clung to, hoping it would one day pull them out of the shadows they had been living in for far too long. On a sweltering Thursday morning, Praise stood in front of the mirror and stared at the woman inside it like she was a stranger. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, and her lips, once full of laughter and careless songs, had thinned into quiet lines. The scarf on her head had loosened from the previous night's twist, hanging half-heartedly like a tired curtain, and her wrapper was frayed at the edges, its original color now muted from daily wear and constant washing. She wiped the mirror with her palm, as if clearer glass would reflect a better reality, but all she saw was more of the same. A woman holding on with both hands to a life that had not yet started. That morning, there was no pap to boil, no akra to reheat. They had eaten the last tuber of yam the night before, slicing it thinner than usual to make it look like more. She checked the small purse tucked inside their zinc bucket, hoping maybe a miracle had snuck in while she slept. Inside was a single 50 Nigerian nairas note, folded like a defeated flag. She pressed it in her palm for a long while, wondering whether to use it for transport or try to trade it for smaller goods at the market. The air in the room was still and hot, filled with that heavy silence that only poverty knows how to cook. Michael was still asleep, his face turned toward the wall, his arm hanging off the bed like a man too tired to hold on. Praise sat beside him, listening to the slow rhythm of his breath, and fought the urge to cry. She had done so quietly too many times already, and there were no tears left to offer. Instead, she leaned against the wall, pulling her knees into her chest and rocking slightly. That morning, she didn't whisper to herself. She didn't pray. She just sat there, eyes wide open, trying to convince herself she wasn't disappearing. It was past noon when Praise finally stepped out, not because she had something to sell, but because the room was suffocating, and staying indoors had started to feel like a form of slow death. She tied her wrapper tighter and walked towards the main road, her sandals scraping against the dusty ground. She carried an empty tray, not to sell, but to look busy enough so no one would stop her with questions she couldn't answer. Along the street, vendors shouted prices of perishable goods, their voices desperate and animated. Children chased each other barefoot, their laughter echoing between cracked buildings and rusted zinc rooftops. Praise walked slowly, blending into the noise, her mind as scattered as the dust blowing across her path. Near the junction, she stopped by a shop that sold sachet water and begged the young girl sitting outside for one sachet, promising to repay the next day. The girl hesitated, then handed her one with a shrug. Praise muttered thanks, sat on the bench beside her, and drank the water slowly, like it was medicine. Her lips stung from the saltiness of her own sweat, and her back ached from sleeping on a worn-out mattress that had grown thinner than their hope. As she sat there, she overheard two women gossiping near the kiosk. They spoke loudly, their voices sharp and careless. "That girl way marry that useless boy still dey suffer oh. I see him yesterday, she done thin like mop stick." The other one cackled and replied, "She get stubborn spirit. Pride no go let her leave. Make she day chop love, nah." The words slid into Praise's ears like small stones dropped into a glass of water, disruptive, uninvited, and cold. She didn't react, just turned her head away and looked at the road ahead. It felt like every corner of the city knew her story and took turns retelling it with new insults. She stood up and walked away, her tray still empty, her spirit just as bare. By the time she returned home that evening, Michael was gone. A note sat on the stool, scribbled hastily on the back of an old newspaper. "Want to try one last place," it said. No name, no time. Just that. She held the paper for several minutes, her eyes refusing to blink. She folded it neatly and placed it under her pillow, then sat on the bed waiting. Not for him, but for anything that would make the silence bearable again. Michael hadn't told her, but he had borrowed a friend's pair of shoes and a faded polo shirt to visit a logistics company in Jericho that he had been stalking for months. They were hiring casual staff, mostly loaders and dispatch assistants, and while the pay wasn't great, it was better than nothing. The only catch was the requirement for 2 guarantors and an address in a decent part of town. Michael had neither. Still, he went, arriving early, sitting outside the gate for almost an hour before they opened. When the guard let him in, he sat on the reception bench and watched people come and go in clean clothes, holding files and talking into phones. He felt like an intruder, an extra in a film about people who had it together. Eventually, a supervisor came out and glanced at him. "You came for the role?" Michael nodded quickly. "You get guarantor?" Michael hesitated. "Not yet, but I can." The man shook his head. "Come back when your story is complete." It wasn't said with malice, just indifference. Michael left the building quietly, stepping into the sun that had started to burn through the morning's cloud. As he walked toward the main road, a Danfo sped past, splashing brown water onto his trousers. He didn't flinch. He just kept walking. That day, he didn't go straight home. He walked for hours, going from street to street, looking at people's faces, trying to convince himself that one day he too would be a man others respected. He bought a loaf of bread with his last 300 Nigerian nairas, tore off the ends, and ate them under a tree near Cocoa House. The pigeons pecked around him, unbothered. At sunset, he returned home, expecting anger or at least worry, but Praise didn't even ask where he had been. She just moved aside for him to sit, and handed him a cup of water without a word. In that moment, Michael realized something that stung more than rejection. They were both running out of the energy it took to care loudly. The following days moved like shadows, present but without form. Praise began to wake up later and later, sometimes not at all until the sun filled the room with enough heat to force her up. Michael spoke less, sometimes going an entire day with only a grunt or nod. They weren't fighting, but there was a quiet war going on between despair and survival. One afternoon, Praise returned from selling a few sachets of spices only to find their landlord waiting at the door. His expression was less angry than usual, but firmer. "Una rent don pass grace," he said. "I go give una 2 weeks. After that, una no wetin go happen." He didn't wait for a response. Just walked away, leaving a faint smell of cheap tobacco behind. Praise entered and sat by the door, her back resting against the wood. She didn't call Michael immediately. She didn't cry either. She just sat there, staring at nothing. When Michael came home that night, she told him. He nodded once, then asked what they had left in the house. She showed him the last portion of Gary in a small plastic container. They soaked it in cold water, added 2 cubes of sugar, and drank in silence. That night, as the candle flickered beside their mattress and shadows danced across the cracked ceiling, Michael finally spoke. "Maybe it's time to try somewhere else." Praise looked at him. "Where?" she asked, her voice brittle. He didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he feared the answer was nowhere. In the dark, they held hands like strangers who had only each other in a sinking boat. No dreams were spoken that night. Just silence. And somewhere in that silence, something shifted, softly like a curtain in the wind. The clouds were already gathering by the time Praise left the market that day, but she kept walking, knowing there was nothing at home to rush to. The last sachets of pepper she carried earlier had all been sold for less than she hoped, yet she held onto the empty tray like it was still heavy, her fingers gripping the edges as if letting go might invite another kind of loss. Her wrapper clung to her legs as the breeze thickened, and the scent of dust mingled with moisture filled the air like a warning. She walked past familiar stalls now covered with faded tarpaulin sheets, their owners already packing up in preparation for the rain. No one looked at her. Not with pity. Not with curiosity. Praise had become invisible in a city that no longer needed stories like hers to feel full. At the junction between Eliel and Alagunru, the sky gave way, and rain came down with a suddenness that felt almost personal. It wasn't the kind of gentle drizzle that slowly soaked you. It was a heavy, unrelenting slap from above. People scattered. Cars slowed. Praise, already soaked, kept walking. There was no shade nearby, no shop willing to take in a drenched woman who might drip mud onto their floor. That was when she saw it. A large SUV stuck diagonally in the mud at the side of the road, wheels spinning helplessly, and a man outside, yelling into his phone with frustration. The driver looked misplaced, his white shirt already stained, his shoes removed, and his voice growing louder as the tires sunk deeper. Praise didn't hesitate. She stepped off the pavement, her slippers already waterlogged, and without speaking, began pushing at the back of the vehicle. The man turned, startled by her presence. He opened his mouth to say something, but she didn't stop. Her bare feet pressed into the thick mud, arms straining against metal, until with a final shove and the help of the revving engine, the car jerked forward, spitting mud behind it. The man jumped in quickly, reversed to dry ground, and got out, panting and covered in splatter. You didn't have to," he said, catching his breath. Praise, equally breathless, wiped her face with her soaked scarf and replied, "It looked like you needed help." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a plastic-wrapped business card, and handed it to her with both hands. "If you ever need anything, seriously." She took it, nodded once, and walked away without waiting for another word. The compound was quiet when she returned, but the rain had followed her all the way home, dripping from her scarf, soaking into her skin, and running down her back like a cold memory. Michael was sitting on the stool, shirtless, a worn piece of cloth draped across his shoulder as he wiped sweat from his brow. He looked up immediately, worry dancing behind his tired eyes. Where you go wait till this kind time? He asked, but not with anger, only fear. Praise didn't speak at first. She walked past him, set the tray down by the corner, and carefully unwrapped the card from where she had tucked it under her scarf. The edges were damp, but the ink was still visible. She held it out. Michael took it, squinted, and read the name, Leonard Iemi. Below that, a bold line read, Real Estate and Logistics. Who be this one? He asked, already suspicious of anything too neat, too bold, too hopeful. Man way get stuck for road. I help push him car, she said, sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes still on the floor. He give me this. Michael stared at the card a moment longer, then passed it back. You go call Am? She hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know yet. He didn't press. There was no energy left between them to argue about possibilities. That night, they boiled the last handful of rice, mixed it with palm oil, and ate in silence. But something in the air had changed. Not completely, not clearly, but faintly, like the smell of firewood when the cooking hasn't started, but the smoke has already risen. Praise tucked the card inside a plastic bag and slipped it under the mattress. She didn't pray that night. She didn't need to. For the first time in weeks, it felt like something might finally come from somewhere. The next morning arrived without ceremony. The sky was dry, the sun dull, and the neighborhood already alive with the hum of regular struggle. Motorbikes roaring to life, children dragging school bags too big for their backs, women haggling over yesterday's vegetables. Praise woke before Michael and sat on the floor, peeling her wrapper off the thin foam. She pulled out the card and stared at it again. The name still looked foreign. Too professional. Too far from her world. But a soft push inside her chest kept urging her to at least try. She dressed in her best blouse, one with sleeves still intact and only a small tear at the hem, and asked Michael to escort her to the taxi junction. You sure say this thing go mean anything? He asked, walking beside her. I know sure, she replied. But even if he no mean anything, at least not different waka. The ride to the office address on the card felt longer than expected. The building stood tall, with clean glass windows and wide steps that made her feel small. The security man looked her over with raised eyebrows. Who you dey find? He asked. Mr. Leonard. Him give me this, she said, holding out the card like an ID. He took it, nodded once, and told her to wait. When she stepped inside the lobby minutes later, her eyes swept the polished tiles, the cold air, and the people walking past in suits. She wanted to shrink, but she stood still. Then Leonard appeared, dressed sharply but smiling the way someone smiles when they remember. You actually came, he said. I was hoping you would. Praise nodded but said nothing. The room didn't feel like hers. Not yet, but it didn't reject her either. Inside the office, Leonard didn't waste time. He asked simple questions, where she lived, what she had done before, how much school she had finished. She told him the truth. All of it. He didn't flinch or frown. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, You helped me when you didn't have to. I believe people like that deserve a chance. He offered her a receptionist role at one of his smaller offices on the mainland. Basic pay, simple tasks, with room to grow. Praise blinked. She wasn't sure if he was serious. You don't need to answer now, he added. Come back tomorrow if you're interested. I just wanted you to know the offer is real. She nodded slowly, her fingers clutched together in her lap. He gave her another copy of the card and stood to walk her out. Outside the gate, the sun was higher and the heat returned. But Praise felt like someone who had stepped into a new wind, one she hadn't felt in years. The city hadn't changed. The roads still groaned under too many cars. The air still smelled of dust and impatience. But her steps felt different. When she returned home, Michael looked up and asked, So? She sat down beside him and let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. He say make I start if I want. Receptionist work. Salary day. Michael nodded slowly. He didn't grin, didn't shout. Just reached for her hand and held it. In that silent moment, it wasn't about celebration. It was about permission to start hoping again. The next morning began with a quiet that felt unfamiliar to Praise. It wasn't the silence of hunger or resignation. It was softer, as though the air itself was waiting. She dressed carefully, not because the clothes were new. They weren't. But because she wanted to walk into that office looking like someone who respected the opportunity, even if the blouse was faded and the skirt had a loose hem she'd stitched the night before. Michael handed her his old wristwatch as she prepared to leave. It had stopped working long ago, the glass scratched and fogged, but he said, It still looks like time, and she smiled, slipping it on. The walk to the junction felt different too. Not lighter, not yet, but steadier. Her legs didn't drag the way they used to, and when she boarded the taxi, she didn't count the coins with the desperation of someone who feared not having enough. She already had the address memorized, but she checked the card again anyway, as if to remind herself that this was real, that she wasn't chasing smoke. When she reached the office, she was greeted by a different guard, one who asked her name without suspicion, and this time, she didn't whisper it. She spoke clearly, her voice low but firm. Inside, the same cool air greeted her, and Leonard met her with a nod of acknowledgement, not surprise. He introduced her to the HR manager, a tall woman named Ifeoma with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority even in small talk. They didn't ask about her qualifications immediately. Instead, they spoke about her values, her experience with people, her patience, her ability to stay calm under pressure. When asked why she wanted the job, Praise answered with the truth. Because I'm tired of surviving on hope alone. There was a pause, then a nod. Papers were signed. A uniform was handed to her, folded neatly inside a branded nylon bag. It wasn't much, but when she touched the fabric, it felt like holding a future. Before she left, Leonard said, "You start next Monday. Be early." She thanked him again, but this time, not with the wide-eyed wonder of someone unworthy. She bowed slightly, said, "I won't disappoint you," and walked out with her chin just a little higher. Back at home, Michael was already sitting outside, waiting near the wooden bench where he sometimes fixed things with no tools. He stood when he saw her approaching, his eyes scanning her face for answers before she even said a word. Praise didn't rush. She sat beside him and placed the nylon bag between them. He opened it carefully, the edge of the shirt peeking out, revealing the company's logo embroidered just above the chest. His breath caught in his throat. "You got it?" She nodded, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The street buzzed with its usual chaos, children chasing kites made of nylon bags, a woman shouting over the price of fish, two bikes nearly colliding at the corner. But in that small moment, it all faded into the background. Michael exhaled deeply, his shoulders sinking like a man who had been holding tension too long. "I knew you would," he said, almost to himself. She smiled, reaching for his hand. They sat there like that, fingers entwined, not needing to speak. When they finally went inside, Praise began tidying the room with a vigor she hadn't shown in weeks. She cleaned the small window, swept the dusty corners, even refolded their clothes. Michael watched her, the corners of his mouth twitching in quiet amusement. "You're behaving like someone who just got promoted," he teased. She turned, hands on her hips, and replied, "Let me start acting like I belong there before I even enter." That evening, they ate beans and Gary with the joy of people having a meal that felt earned. Michael spoke more than usual, telling stories from his university days, some embellished, some not, while Praise listened with the wide-eyed laughter he had missed for months. Sleep came easier that night. There were no haunting thoughts, no ticking clock reminding them of unpaid rent. Just the soft rhythm of breath, side by side, as the city around them carried on without knowing something had quietly shifted in their tiny corner of it. The first week at work came with a mix of awkwardness and awakening. Praise had never used a computer before, so she spent her lunch breaks watching YouTube tutorials with borrowed earphones from the office cleaner, a boy named Sam who looked too young to be working and too tired to be called lazy. The receptionist's desk was near the entrance, where clients walked in with confidence and perfume, some barely offering her a glance. But Praise didn't mind. She was learning. Ifeoma, her supervisor, wasn't warm, but she was fair, correcting Praise's posture, her tone, even how she arranged files, but never with malice. It was a kind of mentorship Praise had never known she needed. She wrote everything down in a small notebook, how to answer calls, how to send emails, how to address people by title. Every mistake felt like a lesson, and every correction, a brick in the foundation of a self she was rebuilding from scratch. On Thursday afternoon, Leonard stopped by and nodded at her desk with a faint smile. "Settling in?" She nodded. "Trying to catch up," he replied. "You're doing better than most people born into it." That night, when she got home, she brought bread and eggs, Real eggs, not just the seasoning cubes they used to mimic taste. Michael stood at the stove, frying it with more care than a chef on TV, and as they ate, they discussed the possibility of him applying at one of the company's warehouses. "You think they'll take me?" he asked. She looked at him, eyes steady. "Why not? You're smart. You just need someone to see it." He didn't reply, but the way he wiped his mouth slowly showed he was considering it. That evening they made plans, not grand ones, but realistic ones. Michael would apply next week. Praise would continue training. They would save little by little. Rent first, then new clothes, then maybe a mattress that didn't sink in the middle. No miracles. Just progress. What neither of them expected was how quickly small changes would begin to ripple outward. On Saturday morning, a neighbor who once mocked Praise for hawking pride in a nylon bag saw her returning from work in her new uniform and called out, "You day work for that big place now?" Praise paused, unsure how to respond. The woman added quickly, "No vex that time, oh. This life not turn by turn." Praise only smiled and kept walking, but inside her, something lifted. Respect wasn't begged for, it was built, and now it was starting to show. At work, she was given the responsibility of organizing a weekend staff training. It was minor, but it meant something. Ifeoma trusted her to handle vendors and logistics, and by Monday, her name had been mentioned during the team meeting. She didn't let the praise swell her head. She simply wrote down more notes, added more questions to ask later, and stayed 15 minutes after closing to clean her space. Michael, on the other hand, received a call from a cousin in Lagos who had seen a business idea he thought they could partner on: dispatch services across schools in Ibadan. It was still just talk, but it gave Michael something new to think about besides rejection. They started saving more deliberately. No more "we'll see." Now it was, "This one is for the rent, and this extra 2,000 Nigerian nairas, let's leave it." Each evening, Praise updated their little notebook. The one that used to hold only prayer points, now it held figures, goals, lists. They still didn't have much, but they had more than they'd ever had before: rhythm, routine, and the strange joy that came from simply being useful. And on a quiet night, as Praise sat on their front step watching the sky darken, she whispered something softly, not a request, not a plea, but a statement. "I think we're getting there." She didn't need a reply. The night answered with silence. A kind, waiting silence. 3 months passed, not with the grand sweep of transformation, but in quiet, barely noticeable shifts, the kind that only revealed themselves when you paused long enough to look back. Praise had settled into her role with a quiet confidence, no longer pausing between sentences when she answered the office phone, no longer fumbling with the printer tray or second-guessing her spelling in emails. She had stopped flinching at compliments too, learning instead to say thank you without apology. The small corner where she sat had become hers, personalized with a plastic flower in a rinsed Milo tin and a sticky note that read, "You're allowed to grow here." Her colleagues, once indifferent, had begun stopping by to ask questions or share lunch, and Ifeoma, who used to speak to her like a trainee, now asked for her opinion in meetings. It was never loud, never dramatic, but Praise was no longer invisible. Outside the office, her world had also begun to stitch itself back together. The landlord who once threatened them with eviction now greeted them with a nod whenever they passed. They had paid off 2 months' rent, and were working on the third. The wooden door that once creaked open to darkness now welcomed them with a soft bulb and a prayer mat tucked neatly beside the mattress. Michael had joined a dispatch training program through Leonard's logistics unit, an unpaid internship for now, but with promise of employment after completion. He came home dusty and tired, but with a spark in his eyes that had been missing for too long. In the evenings they still sat on their small bench, but now they talked about realistic things: saving for a second fan, repainting the room, even buying a radio. They had become a couple not just surviving together, but planning together. And in the stillness of those evenings, they both began to understand that joy didn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it crept in softly, like air through a cracked window, bringing with it the smell of something new and possible. One Saturday afternoon, Michael and Praise decided to visit the market at Agbini to buy a few items for the house. They no longer avoided the busy lanes like they once did, and Praise no longer dropped her eyes when passing familiar faces. She wore a simple blue dress that fit better than anything she'd worn in years, and carried a black leather bag that swung confidently from her shoulder. The market was alive with the same noise and heat it had always known: children weaving through legs, traders shouting discounts they had no intention of honoring, the faint aroma of smoked fish and sun-ripened tomatoes thick in the air. As they moved from one stall to another, choosing carefully and laughing at nothing in particular, a woman called out behind them. Praise turned slowly, and her eyes settled on a face she had tried for years to forget. Mama Alake, the same woman who had once slapped a bag of beans from her hand in public, the same one who had led the chorus of mockery when Praise chose Michael. The older woman was seated behind a small wooden table, her pepper piled in neat pyramids, her face lined deeper than Praise remembered. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, something neither of them could name, but both understood. Mama Alake stood and called her name again, softer this time. Praise! Michael reached for her hand, but she didn't flinch. She walked toward the woman slowly, her posture calm, her steps measured. The woman gave a forced smile, hesitant and uncomfortable. I hear say you day work for big place now. Praise nodded once. I thank God. The woman looked down, then back up. That time, the things way I talk, no be from bad heart. People today talk sometimes. Praise offered a small smile, not out of agreement, but closure. It's okay, she said. The rain falls on everybody's roof. Then, without malice or triumph, she reached into her bag and brought out a small bundle of cash. Take. Buy pepper. Restock. The woman hesitated, then took it with shaking hands. God go bless you, my daughter. Praise returned to Michael, and they continued walking. She didn't look back. Not out of pride, but peace. That evening, they returned home with more than groceries. Their silence on the walk back was comfortable, not heavy. Michael cooked while Praise organized the room, placing a new curtain across the window, one she had bargained for earlier. They ate dinner seated on the floor, their meal simple, boiled plantain and fried eggs, but the taste was richer than they remembered. After eating, Michael brought out the notebook Praise had once used to scribble daily budgets and prayer points. Now it had grown into something more layered, half planner, half testament. He flipped through the pages, pointing at old entries. See this one, he said, tapping the line that once read, Plan, get small job. Any job. Just start. They both laughed softly. She took the book from him, turned to a fresh page, and wrote, Next, move to two-room apartment. He nodded approvingly, then picked up a pen and added underneath, By fan that doesn't hum like generator. They kept writing, small dreams, half-jokes, and tentative ideas, like children passing notes under the desk of reality. When they finally turned out the light, they lay on the mattress with the fan buzzing softly, and the sounds of distant traffic humming through the walls. Praise turned to him and asked, If I hadn't helped that man that day, what do you think would have happened? Michael didn't answer right away. He reached for her hand in the dark, squeezed it gently. Maybe nothing, he said. Or maybe God just used that mud to dig us out. She smiled, even though he couldn't see it. And for the first time in years, sleep didn't feel like escape. It felt like reward. Not everything was perfect, but the worst was behind them. And sometimes, surviving was its own kind of success. The next morning was bright with the kind of sun that made colors pop and clothes dry faster. Praise stood outside, hanging their laundry on the line. The air smelled of soap and wet fabric, a scent she had come to associate with small progress. As she clipped Michael's shirt to the line, a neighbor stepped out of her room carrying a bowl of oji and moin moin. The woman, once among the voices that had whispered about Praise's poor choices, now walked over without hesitation. I dey go your side later, she said. Make I ask you small something about work. My sister dey fine job. Praise nodded, offering a smile. No vale. She fit come see me Monday. The woman thanked her and walked off, leaving behind the faint echo of her surprise, because kindness from those who once suffered often carries more weight than kindness from those who never did. As Praise returned inside, she caught a glimpse of herself in the cracked mirror leaning against the wall. She paused, taking in the woman reflected back. There were still lines under her eyes, still rough patches on her elbows, but her posture was different. There was no slump in her shoulders, no tired sag in her cheeks. She didn't look wealthy, but she looked whole. Michael came in moments later, holding a brown envelope. Leonard sent this through someone at the site, he said. Inside was an offer letter for full-time employment at the logistics branch, modest pay, but stable. Michael looked at her with the cautious joy of someone who had learned not to hope too loudly. I think it's finally starting, he said. Praise held the envelope, ran her finger along the edge, and smiled. It already started, she replied. This is just the part where people begin to notice. They sat side by the window, watching the light spill across their small room, and in that moment, they didn't need music, didn't need miracles. They had their story, and that at last was enough. No matter how long it takes, never despise the days when life feels slow, silent, or unfair. Sometimes, what looks like delay is actually preparation. You may not see it now, but one act of kindness, one moment of faith, one small step of endurance can become the turning point in your story. Don't give up before your time comes. When life is quiet, it doesn't mean you're forgotten. It might just mean you're next in line. May your patience not be in vain. May your silent tears turn to loud laughter. May the same places where you were mocked become the ground where your testimony will shine. May helpers locate you even when you're not looking. May your hands never lack what to hold. May your home be filled with peace, your path with light, and your heart with unshakable joy. May God turn your almost into finally, your not yet into now, and your if only into thank you, Lord. And may the people who doubted you live long enough to witness your rising. If you believe this, shout a big amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.